what I wanted to do in this final presentation is to not only talk about chiasm or chiasm, now everybody's going to be self-conscious with this, but to do a little bit of cultural study with this. And so we're going to, in this process, obviously deal with a number of patterns, but I'd like to also think of you all. Now, not all chiasms were done necessarily intending it to be, they were all done intending to be heard by readers, but not necessarily to be memorized on the spot. But many were all written. We're talking about structured text. And so I labeled this as a window to Chiasmus and Apostolic Pedagogy. I wanted to talk a little bit about what was the intention for doing these. Just to record for posterity, to communicate better, to help for memorization. Why use them? What was the point of it? I mean, certainly to put on a conference and to enjoy our time together, and it's been wonderful, but why? Why do it? And so some of it is going to be a cultural study where we're going to step back in time a little bit, or maybe not even in time in some of our day and age, to step into another place. Because there are oral cultures yet in this world where they don't have necessarily their communication in writing yet. And I'd like to draw attention in our study to what I'm going to do to David Dorsey's book, The Literary Structure of the Old Testament. He was my Old Testament counterpart at Evangelical Seminary. And he talked about a crucial link in Old Testament text, and a common expression of his is a conscious surface structure. In other words, it was just an intended design of the writer. You know, it wasn't some structure that you had to go digging deeply and searching for. It was just like we use sentences and paragraphs. It was a surface design that was intended to be seen. Like we put up the chips yesterday with Hickory Dickory Dock for those who were there. You could see the color design easily. It was meant to be transparent in that sense. A little harder for us because we don't need to communicate like that. We have such an abundance of writing and technology. And so this is a landmark study, and it is on the display in the lobby there. And one of the things he emphasizes in structure is that it conveys meaning. Now, this is significant. We spent a lot of time, and we have touched on this in a lot of our sessions, but one of the things that he draws out and pays particular attention to is that part of what structure is intended to do is not neatly just to outline text, but as we have been seeing, it's also meant to convey meaning by virtue of the pattern itself. So it hasn't just arranged text to help somebody learn it, or maybe even to draw attention to a particular center, but by the arrangement to express meaning. So the meaning itself is also intended to teach. It's pretty provocative. And so he says there are three things we want to keep in mind, and some of this is rehearsing, but he talks about, now he's not just talking about chiasm, as we've talked about. Obviously, this is a very common way of communication, but there could be parallel patterns. There could be linear. Most documents are written intended to be read from front to beginning at the beginning of the document and read to the end. So there's a linear conception to these as well. So the composition's overall structure, obviously a chiasm as we've been thinking about. Obviously structured repetition and all that this may involve. And then thirdly, positions of prominence. And we've been talking about this a lot in various ways throughout these days. Now, and we've been just talking about this as macro and as micro with the overall. I've called it book-wide. We could call it like the table of contents in a book. You'd first of all look and just see, okay, how's this book laid out overall? You're not so much worried about what is going to get said in this particular chapter or what she's going to do in this unit, but just what's in the book. And so you look at the table of contents. That's kind of the book-wide layout. Now, most aren't laid out chiastically. Most writers don't do that. We don't have to. We have tables of contents. But it's the idea. That's giving you the book-wide layout. And then subsections may be, you go to that particular chapter, sometimes they show it in the table of contents, how a particular chapter may be subdivided. And so we could call those subsections. Now, I'm from Lancaster, Pennsylvania. I just told, I believe it was Jared, who I found out is from Lidditz, and in fact found out that Jared grew up 2 streets away from me. Jared, are you in the room? No? He's out, yeah, he's out at the desk doing his job, as I guess he should be doing. And his youngest sister graduated with my daughter from high school. Imagine that. Anyhow, now I forget the reason why I told him we have a chocolate factory in Lidditz. And I said, well, I should have brought you some Wilbur buds because I didn't know you were here. And he said, well, you know, there were some Amish that had a little store not far from here, and I could actually get Wilbur buds. I thought, wow, you're kidding. But anyhow, back in Lancaster, one of the big things with Amish are quilts. Great at making quilts. And so, like a quilt, notice the intended design. Notice the repetition. Look at the overall pattern. And sometimes there are positions of prominence. Now, this doesn't really have it. There's not one particular design in the middle. It's pretty repetitive through the whole thing. But then within that quilt, each quilt is composed of a lot of quilt blocks. We could call them subsections or micro sections of the macro, the quilt itself. And each one of those quilt blocks, now this is enough from the quilt itself, notice the patterning within it. So while the overall quilt has its overall design, it's composed of a lot of individual quilt blocks. And each of those blocks have their individual designs as well. So we could talk about a macro pattern, how a book has its overall layout intended. It could be very well chiastic, and often is, within, as Dr. Dorsey has shown within the Old Testament, within this book shows, and the overall pattern for each of the Old Testament books, most are chiastic, and then he shows the second level. In other words, the pattern for each point of the overall pattern for each of the books, and then goes into explanations for those, lets you interact with this thinking for each. Very interesting. And so what I'm interested in is this bridge. Well, does the New Testament do that? When I was with him, here he was about ready to send it off to the publisher. When I had first started at Evangelical, he had already been there for 15 years. And I had done academic editing work for Baker and Zondervan at the time. And I said, boy, I'd love if you'd like, for me just to give it a read through for it. And boy, it was kind of, not baptism by fire, it was wonderful. And just became very kind of immersed in just this patterning. And I just kept wondering, wow, does the New Testament do this? I've seen proposed patterns and commentaries for this passage and that passage, but that's not what he's talking about. He's saying, is it like that quilt? Is a book like that quilt? Is a whole fabric? Kind of like what we were looking at for John and some of this stuff. Is it a way that they just conceived of the document? And so what I would like to do here is, we wish the Lord could make the sun stand still and these 20 minutes could turn into 2 hours, but that's been the sentiment of the last 15 presentations. So nothing new under the sun. So what I would like to do, instead of presenting a lot of chiasms, I'd like to focus on one story. And in this sense, I'd like to look at it applied. I'd like to be thinking of you all. What's the relationship of the story in a context of a time that is very oral? We're talking about structured text. In other words, when we think of biblical literature, we're talking about material that is written. So it is text. But we're talking about a structure at a time then we didn't write like we do now because we don't have. And so it's all written in the sense of orality. It's meant to be heard. It's written in a way that's going to fit in with how people can take it with them or hear it, because that's how text is always digested. That's how people are going to connect with it. That's, in a major way, a point of text. Not the entire way. There are other reasons, too, for text being recorded and for chiasms to be written. And so we don't want to say, this is, the only reason. And so basically 3 very quick ways that I'd like to give us a snapshot of this afternoon is we're going to look at Jesus' healing of the Roman centurion's servant in Matthew chapter 8, just this little story, in 3 ways. First of all, I'd like to just take a step back and look at the quilt. This is the patch. This is the little block of quilt we're going to look at, but I want to look at the quilt. Real quick, not the whole quilt, but a little bigger picture in it. Secondly, then, I want to just do an analysis of that story, keeping some of Dr. Dorsey's ideas in mind. But then thirdly, think of apostolic pedagogy. Why are they doing this? How do they have the listener in mind? What are they to take away with this? How are we getting kind of a window to what the apostles were doing? Whether with the actual written Gospels or Paul in his writings, Peter in his writings, or for a long time, there was a lot of oral preaching and proclamation long before some of these documents were written down, right from the get-go. And certainly could be repeated in the Old Testament in its own ways. And I'm just speaking of the biblical era. Of course, how oral traditions were used in other cultures would be interesting as well, like with Mesoamerica and so on. And so, with the literary setting, notice chapter 8, verses 5 through 13 takes place in chapter 8, verses 1 through 17. What we have here, if you looked it up in your Gospels, it is in a context of 3 miracle episodes. It's followed by a short section of Jesus' 2 teachings on disciples, 2 would-be disciples. It's followed by 3 episodes of miracles. These are so dynamic. It's almost the gospel in Jesus' life in these 3. Talks about Jesus and his crossing the sea often as a symbol of death, and it shows the sovereignty over the sea. Then he lands, and there is a demoniac, and this is what was the legion of demons in Mark's gospel. And then he, shows the sovereignty over demons. Then he returns to the other side of the sea in the paralytic, and he heals them. But in that day, sin was, to have certain sins was associated with judgment from God. And some were saying, well, this man blasphemes. Only God can forgive sins. And Jesus says, so that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. He says, which is easier to say to the man, your sins are forgiven, or stand up and walk. Obviously, it's easier to say your sins are forgiven, because who can see sins forgiven? But working with their assumption, if you can make the man walk, you would assume, okay, God has forgiven the sins. And so by making the man walk, he was showing he's able, what he could do in the skin, he could also do in the spirit. So what did he do? He showed his sovereignty over death, showed his sovereignty over demons, and showed his sovereignty over sin. If you look in Hebrews chapter 2, verses 14 through 18, it shows Jesus became flesh to do 3 things. Conquer death, the devil, make atonement for sin. Why is he able to do that in his death? He showed his sovereignty over it in his life. That's the second triad of miracles. When Jesus sent the disciples out, they were probably teaching that. These patterns were probably organized by Jesus during his earthly ministry with the disciples. Anyhow, we're never going to get through this, but it's followed by a longer section of teaching on discipleship. Here we have where Jesus invites Matthew to follow him. Followed up then at this point where Jesus gives the analogy of the bridegroom. Why no fasting like John's disciples fast? Well, the bridegroom's here. Why fast when the bridegroom's here? You celebrate. Followed up then by the newness that comes with Jesus. The idea of pouring new wine into new wineskins, not old wineskins. That'll make them burst and so on. This then is followed by another triad of miracles episodes, which then concludes with a whole chapter on discipleship teaching. Here Jesus calls now the 12 disciples, and he is preparing to send them out. So when Wayne was talking about the macro, you could almost see this large unit. This is a main unit in Matthew's overall gospel, one of 7. You could almost see this as, we don't talk about, well, I guess we still have filing systems with filing cabinets. You could almost see this whole unit as a filing cabinet drawer. And some of you younger people, bear with me, you may not know what one of those things are, but anyhow. You could almost see it as a filing cabinet drawer with a lot of files in it. And each of these A's is a file in it, and the B's are a file in it. And so each one of these are containing a lot of information. And there are a lot of relationships of meaning that establish the A's as one strand and the B's as a discernible strand. And so it's very easy to recognize these as a workable unit, working at a macro level. Now, what I'm not doing here is what is awesome is each of these miracles have their own patterns. Each of the B points have their own patterns. And so you could break down every one of these points and they have their own patterns. Awesome patterns. When you're able to demonstrate that with the macro and the micro, or the big and then the smaller, then you have a feeling that you're getting closer to the author's mind. Obviously, there's lots of tightening and stuff. But when they're tight and they're working conceptually and with repeated grammar and stuff like that and wording, that you're close to the writer's mind and not so much just working on a very ingenious way of looking at the text that's maybe coming from me or whatever. What is interesting here with the red, this is the strand of the miracle episodes. You say, well, what is the relationship between the strand of miracle working and then the strand of Jesus' call to discipleship? Well, it becomes really dynamic. What's the significance of following Jesus in relationship to what his miracles show about him? And so that's what's going on here. When the disciples ultimately are sent out to talk about the kingdom that has come in Jesus, what are they going to talk about? It's not so much the wow of the miracle that's important, is what do his miracles say about him? That's important. Now, what is interesting is the episode we're looking at, and that's how I distinguish the red and the blue. The red is the first strand of miracles. The blue is the strand of discipleship. Now, I'll keep moving here and not take the time to read. I will say I have my PowerPoint. I just know if my students were here from the seminary, they would all just say amen to this, that, notoriously, I do a lot of filler things and not always quite state a script. I get the script done, but a lot of other things in between, so time is always an issue. So I have everything for you there. So this is all in your notes. The whole PowerPoint is there, word for you. For whatever I'm showing you here, you've got. So I don't feel quite as bad just jumping forward. Now what I'm doing is I'm giving you the first miracle episode. We're going down to a sub-point. This is still the broader context. So I gave you the overall unit. Now the first triad of miracles, the first cluster of 3 episodes. And so it's really fascinating. The first one involves a leper. The second one involves a woman. Two parties in their individual ways that were somewhat marginalized in first century Palestine. Obviously a leper. And women were. To boot, this is an older woman, Peter's mother-in-law. So she's, she's had her family. Peter married her daughter. We don't know anything else about her, how many children she had, but we know she's living with Peter in her home. She's really sick. But what is very interesting that is featured in both of the 8 points is that Jesus appropriately, and you can underline appropriately, touches both. This is amazing for a leper. Jesus could have pronounced the leper clean. But imagine what it did to the man that Jesus reached out and touched him. That leper knew at least what everybody else was saying about him until some point he believed it himself. Leprosy, paralysis, blindness, and so on. Remember in John 9, 1 and 2, when the disciples passed the man who couldn't see? They asked Jesus, who sinned, that man or his parents? The assumption was the reason he can't see is because of sin. So to what extent that leper believed that of himself, even though he had no idea what was the sin. Wow, what was it for Jesus to touch him? And it's the same Greek word then that's used for Jesus. We're told that Jesus reached out and touched the hand of Peter's mother-in-law when he found out she was sick. Instead of just willing it from another room, and he went in and touched her hand. And so notice the commonality, lots of them between the two themes, but one important way, how did Jesus in part go about the healing? Notice the touch. Now the episode we're looking at in between the two is that Jesus doesn't touch. He's not even there. He's not even in the room. It's like he's out in the courtyard outside the building. Or maybe he's at the Y, way up on the mountain. Maybe more like it. In other words, I don't know if, he's that far away where, he could holler and you couldn't hear him. He's not present. And so you can already get a feeling why this may have significance as, remember Dorsey talked about the position of prominence? Here he's going to do a miracle and he's not even there. Where at least the other two, he is present to touch the person, and that communicated a lot. And then what's very significant here is that there's a climaxing summary statement. What's interesting in its parallel A point, that closing A point of the 3 miracle episodes, it has an A, B, A, and a closing C, and the closing C is also a summary statement of Jesus' healing ministry. And so it matches that as well. Well, analysis of the story, this we're going to look at point B, and we're going to move our way through this. And nice picture of the Roman and his servant here. Has a 6-point chiasm here. And the 2 blues that open and close with the physical condition of the servant. The 2 B's has to do with how Jesus is going to do the healing. The 2 C's then are the positions of prominence that we'll talk about. But I've just put it in the different color configurations so it helps us to be able to just visualize it. Now, you be the reader now. This is our little piece. We can talk about the takeaway of this. But now you're meant to memorize that. Well, not that. That's just a summary. You're meant to memorize this little text. But knowing the organization, it's very easy to memorize it. If you were just given the paragraph of it, beginning with the indented first word and the unending stream of words to the end of the paragraph, that's a lot harder. But when you see the layout, now it's kind of three-dimensional. It has actual life to it. It's a lot easier now to put the words to memory. But you're just not memorizing it. You're going to also now go with the apostolic teaching. In just memorizing the words, you're going to be able to carry with it the apostolic teaching that went with the matching points, just by memorizing the words. Now, you're going to need some mentoring. You're going to need some instruction. You just can't get it on your own. So that always went with it. So whether you had it with what was read to you and taught, or in the case an apostle came and wasn't able to actually give you anything in writing, but remember, it's an oral culture. They memorize very easily. And so the two A points, and now this is my translation of the Greek, when Jesus had entered Capernaum, a centurion came up to him, pleading with him, saying, "Lord, my servant is lying at home, paralyzed, suffering terribly." Now the blue matches up his servant instead of my servant, and instead of being what? Suffering what? He's healed. At that point, at that moment, literally the Greek is at that hour. Sometimes that expression means at this instant. So in the first instance, he's at home. In other words, right now, he's at home. Now it's at that moment. What we have here is what is a contrast. We can refer to them as literary pairs. So you have your two A's. And so what is a paired meaning? Contrast is one or more things between the matching points is slightly to highly different. Well, it's obvious. The servant is really sick and suffering badly. How does it end? He's healed. If you stood the chiasm on its side, it's a pyramid. What's the foundation? The miracle. It's not the point of it, but it supplies the basis for its teaching. It's so important. The two B's are really remarkable. This is how Jesus is going to go about doing the miracle. The first B says, what's in green is the narrative introduction. Jesus said to him, now notice, in the red, he says, I'll go. And in the blue, how he's going to do it. Heal him. Maybe touch him. But now it's matching point. Something crazy happened. Starts the same in the green. Jesus said to him. Jesus, the speaker again. He's initiating this conversation. But something happened. This is a Roman soldier, hated of the Jews. Jesus says to him, go. As you have believed, let it be done to you. What happened? Have the contrast. It's the going. The first Greek word is erchomai. It's the word that's used all the time of Jesus going, coming, and going all throughout Galilee and Palestine in his ministry. The second Greek word is hupago. It means to go away, but it can carry the sense to go away secretly. The idea is that Jesus is just quietly talking to this Roman centurion at this point and says, just go home. And I'll do it like I said. In other words, he doesn't need 2,000, he doesn't need all the multitudes there either. Just go. He doesn't need all the crowds that are with Jesus and Jesus going and all the commotion at the house. You just go. Just quietly go your way. Just go off to your home. And it'll be done as you said. Imagine this guy. There's a parallel because who's the healer in both of the B's? Jesus. That didn't change. But notice there's progression. Progression is that the matching point, the second B point, shows progression, logical progression or development of the thought or behavior from the opening point. You're the reader. All you had to memorize was that text. But now as you think of how the text is organized, that organization itself has meaning. Look how Jesus is so pleased to change how he was going to do the miracle to honor the faith of the centurion. What does that suggest about prayer? Point C, we're at the center. I won't take the time to read it all. Oh. The two blues are the comment on faith. The first blue, no faith is used. He says, only say the word and my servant will be healed. What is red then is the faith illustrated. He says, I know what that looks like. I have servants. I say, come, he comes, go, he goes. I know what that authority looks like. Can you imagine? This man just watches Jesus behave, and he knows, hey, his words are like mine. I tell a servant to go do it. I don't think twice. I'm a Roman officer. If that servant doesn't do what I said, that servant's neck is on the block. I don't have to question. And it seems like when Jesus does it, it's the same thing. But I'm talking to a human. He's talking about disease. I'm unworthy to have this man come into my house. All he has to do is just stay right where he is. All he has to do is just will it, and I know it'll happen. What's Jesus say? He said, I have not seen anybody in Israel that has simply placed faith in me like that. Then what follows in red is his elaborating on faith. You can see the significance of this as the center. All you have to do is memorize the text. Have the apostolic guidance. What do you take with you? All you memorize was just the words of the text. And the structure helps you to memorize it accurately. Continuity between the 2 points. The second point continues the idea of the first point, whether it extends a particular idea, theme, or storyline of the opening point. And you know, the opening point with Jesus' his display of faith, and then Jesus comments on his remarkable display of faith, and what modeling grounds faith in him, models the grounds by which people will sit with Abraham in the kingdom. I just need to close. I'm going to skip these points where just making the mention of, here I just used a little recorder that's like you go to a historical site, you know, and you want to visit something, and they'll give you a little recorder, walk around, press number 1, and it'll tell you the historical background of that site, go number 2. It's kind of like this. All you have to do is memorize the text, and you have the built-in apostolic instruction on it with a little guidance. Think of that. Anyhow, just in closing, structured texts were designed to be very accessible and understandable to the lay person. I don't like using that term, but that's over against the apostles or whoever is doing the teaching. They were designed to be reader-friendly. Now, again, I realize there are a lot of, even within the Bible, that not all chiasms and structured texts were necessarily meant just to be like this particular one we looked at. But they did require some training and instruction. It sure helps a lot more for me just telling you this text. You go memorize it versus a little guidance on it. Now it makes. Secondly, the text's internal structure facilitated and safeguarded accurate memorization. So note the organization of it helped you also in its memorization versus just a flat paragraph. Third, a text's internal structure simultaneously provided built-in apostolic instruction on the text itself, and with guided instruction, like we've said. Fourth, memorization of a collection of such pieces of structured text would have allowed the apostles to leave careful and precise gospel teaching and Christian instruction with converts and fellow Christians even after they had left that particular locality. So even without written text, an apostle goes to a region and founds a church, and there are particular individuals there. Suppose, they would have left 20 pieces of text that the people would have memorized and been instructed on this and had it in their hearts. They are leaving very grounded people. It's hard for us because we don't need to memorize anything like that necessarily to appreciate that. And again, this is a window. We've rubbed our hand on a window. We're looking through a glass dimly, kind of. And so it sounds like I'm stating this as fact, but we're kind of looking and thinking about what structured text, chiasm, in culture is perhaps giving us glimpses of. And finally, another benefit here is that and with this I'll finish it, and the added benefit was that having the information memorized rather than just written down will also have greatly enhanced it being taken to heart and applied to life and not quickly forgotten. Whether for elders teaching in the church or for parents teaching their children or for the mutual edification of fellow Christians or for one's personal walk with God and Jesus Christ. It's one thing carrying around material on a copy, but I could say, where did I leave that? But if somebody is memorizing the teaching of Jesus Christ in their hearts, there's a much better chance they're not going to forget where they left that. It's going to go where they go.